Modern man wants to be happy. Happiness is so important to us that we have called the pursuit of happiness an inalienable right of every person and enshrined it in the U.S. Declaration of Independence. The pursuit of happiness, according to this document, is as important as life and liberty. Each of us is supposed to want to pursue happiness as much as we want to exist, but how reasonable is it to pursue happiness? Should one look for it in one's book, Stumbling Over Happiness? Psychologist Daniel Gilbert argues that we don't direct our lives toward happiness, rather it just happens to come into our lives. And if a person tries by all means to make himself happy, most likely he will not succeed. After all, we are very bad at predicting our future emotions. Imagine two scenarios: in one you win $1 million in the lottery. In the other, you find yourself paralyzed from the neck down for the rest of your life. What made you happier? Intuitively, the answer seems obvious, but according to a 1978 study, lottery winners and paralyzed people are about equally happy. And paralyzed people find even more pleasure in simple daily activities than millionaires. Another illustration of the misconception of happiness is our attitude toward old age. Old age in today's materialistic world is considered a time of decline, decay, and general degradation. Young people look to the future with apprehension and foresee a dismal life filled with sadness and slow fading. But few people know that happiness reaches its peak at the age of 75, and after 62 you will be happier than at 18. By the way, the same tendencies are observed even in monkeys. The modern young people, obeying erroneous cultural prejudices, are trying to plan their own happiness. They are afraid of growing old and rush to make themselves happy, preferably before 30. To consume as much goods as possible to experience the maximum number of sensual pleasures and make their life bright so there will be something to remember in old age. But contrary to the misconceptions of our time, the real potential for happiness comes with experience. It is old age wisdom and depth that opens the door to a most joyful world. Our errors are very varied and many of us do not want to work, expecting it to make them happier. However, it is not busyness that is the main factor in an unhappy life. Many people dream of expensive things, but according to research, it's not the things that make us happy, it's the experiences, which are often worthless. In other words, seeking happiness is not the smartest idea. Happiness is a consequence, not a goal. The ancient Greeks understood this very well. They, too, believed that the meaning of each person's life was happiness. But they did not imagine a happy life the way that modern people do. The word they used, eudaimonia, did not mean pleasure and frustration, but rather a certain spirit of life. Happy life they called a virtuous and meaningful life. They believed that the highest pleasure comes from the constant direction of the will toward the fulfillment of the moral law. To be happy, a man should not strive for happiness, but show wisdom, courage, justice, and moderation, and happiness would be the consequence of a right life. The same man, instead of moral perfection, grasps every sensual pleasure in the hope of becoming happy, who instead of working on his flaws indulges in fun and lives according to the principle of primitive hedonism, avoiding pain and striving for joy, not only remains unhappy, but cannot realize his potential. Striving for happiness is what he misses. Philosophers call this the paradox of hedonism. Here is how Viktor Frankl writes about it in his book Man in Search of Meaning. Happiness is like a butterfly, the more you catch it, the more it slips away. But if you shift your attention to other things, it will come and quietly sit on your shoulders. It can't be pursued, it has to be a consequence. It comes as a side effect of personal devotion to a cause and values that are greater than yourself. Modern science confirms this as well. A 2017 study showed that those of us who pursue self-interest in everything, obviously expecting a happy life, are far less happy others. If you act out of higher values, for example, by generously sacrificing your resources simply because you think it is right, you will be much happier than the average person. In other words, the Greeks were right: higher happiness or eudaimonia is a consequence of a virtuous life directed toward a higher goal. For example, justice, wisdom, or goodness. Plato depicted man as a chariot pulled by two horses. The dark horse represents the physical desire for pleasure. The white horse represents virtue. Both are necessary for the chariot to move, and the chariot itself is the mind that directs their movement in the direction of the good. It is the good, or some supertask that transcends our nature, but not personal happiness, that can claim to be the goal of a fulfilled person's life. Thus, a wholesome man is one who, in addition to basic animal desires, has a longing for something that surpasses his nature. Or as Nietzsche writes, while someone desires only happiness, he has not yet raised his eyes above the animal horizon, for he merely more consciously desires that which the animal seeks with blind impulse. According to Nietzsche, it is those who stop seeking happiness who are the greatest human beings, for only such people are capable of upholding abstract values like freedom, pursuing knowledge, and striving for perfection, no matter what. Alain Badiou adds to this list the capacity for true love. In his book In Praise of Love, he writes that the modern obsession with happiness has created a culture of love for pleasure. The dominant idea today is that love is just another option for getting the widest range of pleasurable experiences. The task of such love is to avoid any serious challenge to the profound experience of any difficulty, of which true love is woven. Thus modern man, in planning his own happiness, chooses people who are pleasant, comfortable, but limit the depth. We know by experience from many studies that personal growth is impossible without experiencing the full spectrum of emotions, from terror to bliss, from despair to joy. By cutting this spectrum in half, a person not only deprives himself of development, but also limits what is so passionately desired, the feeling of a good life. In fact, by striving for pleasant feelings, we stop even thinking. Gilles Deleuze describes thought as violence against things and the breaking of established categories. Independent thought is always a bit uncomfortable. It takes us out of a soft abode of comprehensibility and forces us into conflict with the objects of the world around us, to rethink them. We know from a 2012 study that those who strive for happiness do less deep thought work, and that's not surprising, because thinking is painful, just as much as standing up for freedom, building deep relationships, and searching for meaning in life. To make us aware of the happiness in these things, to transcend the imposed consumerist picture of the world and move closer to a more conscious life beyond animal values, let us use the ideas of Meng Tzu. He distinguished between two forms of the human self: the lesser self and the greater self. The lesser self seeks happiness through the satisfaction of biological needs such as food, relaxation, and comfort. And the larger self seeks a deeper form of happiness, through the realization of a higher purpose. The lesser self exists only to provide for the greater self. Yes, relaxation is pleasant in and of itself, but it is only truly satisfying after a hard day's work toward a higher goal. Relaxation should not become an end in itself. It is a logical consequence of labor. Likewise with food, no matter how tasty it may be, it is first and foremost understood as a tool for approaching a deeper purpose. It feeds the body and enables the greater self to approach the higher realms of life, such as art, truth, justice, goodness, and attention. According to Meng Tzu, each person should actively cultivate his or her larger self. It does not appear by itself. We must engage in deep thought and moral work to discover and sustain its life. We are to understand. What do we really value? What drives us? What does perfection look like? And how do we act to achieve it? How many in today's world truly know how a perfect person acts and compare their actions to it? The example of Muslims would be helpful here. They want to be like their prophet. He is the perfect man and his life is the perfect life. And every adherent of this religion tries to conform to his example. His task is to transform his essence by renouncing the yug or nafs. Any action of a Muslim could be placed on a graph, where the y-axis is conformity to perfection and the x-axis is time. Ideally, each time food consumption, prayer or work is performed closer and closer to the ideal and, therefore, with the least presence of ego. In this way, the Muslim evolves by trying his greater self and by getting closer to true happiness. Following the example of Muslims, each of us can comprehend the perfect man. What is he like? What are his values? How does he act? What does he strive for? The next step is to maximize perfection. By mentally placing each of our actions on a graph of ideal actions, by repeating after the ideal, we will develop our ability to distinguish the good from the bad, the permissible from the impermissible, the true from the false. We will understand what our larger self requires. And by surpassing animal nature, we will come closer to the experience of eudaimonia.